Hello everyone. Today we have with us for the fifth episode Awais Ahmed, co-founder of Pixxel. A week ago, there was a tweet from ISRO. The chairman K. Sivan said that the next launch, that is PSLV C51, is going to be a special one for them because Anand, that is one of the first satellite by an Indian-grown startup, will be launched on February 2021. We have with us the creator of Anand. So, can we know how did you come up with that let's startup moment? What was the story behind it, and what was the thing that made you motivate towards finding an Indian space tech startup?
Sure. So I think the first, it was a combination of factors leading into the creation of Pixel. We never started out with the goal that we would begin a company or start a startup. What we wanted to do essentially, creating a startup ended up being the best way for us to create value and do what we love. So how it came to be is, so there are a couple of experiences while I was studying at BITS that led to Pixel. The first was I was part of the student satellite team at the university that was working with ISRO, and that's where I got to learn how do you build a satellite, what hardware goes into it, how do you create something that can withstand the harsh environments of space. And the second experience was I was one of the founding team members and engineering lead at Hyperloop India. SpaceX had this 1 mile long vacuum tube at their headquarters in Los Angeles, and they had an open challenge to teams around the world to build vehicles that could travel at really fast speeds inside that vacuum tube. Hyperloop India was the only team that was selected, and this was way back in 2017. And that is an experience where I had the steepest learning curve. We had to learn how to build a vehicle that had not been built before. There was not a lot of material online. There was no people that we could reach out to for advice. And it was a bunch of undergraduate students that were competing with the likes of PhDs and postgraduates somewhere else, right? So that made me realize that a bunch of motivated people, regardless of their age or background, are able to create something like this. And while at LA at the SpaceX HQ, they took us on a tour of their factory where we saw rocket engines being built, rocket components being built, and that rekindled a love that I always had for space. We've always wanted to be astronauts at some point in life. We've always looked up at the stars as kids, and that sort of gets suppressed while we grow up. But then that was rekindled during that visit, and I knew that this was the space and the sector for me to be in. So once we came back from there, I just read up all I could about space technology, where it is moving, what is the cutting edge, what could be done, what are the gaps, and started working with existing satellite imagery. AI and satellite imagery sort of went really well to tackle some issues at first hand seen, like illegal mining, pollution monitoring, or a whole host of other things. So while working with this data is when I stumbled upon a gap in the industry, is that existing satellite imagery can't even see certain problems. So you can build your camera in a fundamentally different way and then have a satellite around that would capture a lot more of the information that you can see from space. And reached out to companies and organizations that were working with satellite imagery in one form or the other. And they confirmed that if we were able to deliver to them the data of the quality and the composition that we were talking about, they would pay for it. So that was the validation, that there's a gap, there's an opportunity. Want to work in space, and being in India, we had seen what ISRO has done. There is the talent, the expertise, and the experience in the country to do it. So all of that sort of converged at the time and said, this is something that we could do. We'll take a step back and solve the more fundamental issue, which is providing high quality data from space. So that's how Pixel came to be.
So, Awais, how is the space tech scene right now in the world and in India? Like, we don't see too many space tech startups in India, and even in the world, I think there'll be a handful. So, how difficult is it for as an entrepreneur to get funding or to get projects for your startup?
Yeah, so I think globally versus India, the situation and the stage and the maturity of the space ecosystem is different. Globally, it's taking off in its literal sense. The amount of funding that has flown into space tech startups has only increased year on year, even including 2020 during the pandemic, right? And in fact, I think a lot of startups in the space sector have been resilient. So it's been about 8 to 10 years in the making. With SpaceX started in 2002 with Blue Origin, but then in the starting of 2010s, 2011s, 2012, a lot of startups that have come up whose success stories have led to more and more startups being created in the past 5 years. So globally, it's been going on really well. There's a lot of comparison and analogy to be drawn to the IT industry in the 1970s or 80s, where Apple, Microsoft, etc., were sort of leveraging the miniaturization of electronics. They were leveraging the coming down of cost, which is similarly what's happening on the space domain. So we are at that stage where it's growing rapidly, and there's enough funding available globally. Once you have demonstrated that you can do something. However, coming to the Indian side of things, it's still in the very early stage. Most of the startups that you talk about have only been in this sector for the last 2 years, and there's not even a single success story yet in terms of having working hardware up in space or having a rocket up in space and things like that. So that will take about at least 2 to 3 years for certain success stories to come out. So it's very nascent here, and the opening by the government is sort of at the right opportune moment where we need to really pick up the pace if we have to keep pace with China or the US. So that's what I would say. It's quite radically different in the US, in Europe, globally versus in India. It's still quite nascent, but it's definitely picking up. In this year alone, in 2020, we saw quite a few funding rounds for space tech startups here, and globally, it's been going on for some time.
That sounds great. And we also got to know that you also received the $5 million funding recently. So that's great news for us. So there are lots of different things about startup. For some people say that if you want to start a startup, you need to have a daredevil heart. Some say that you need to have a great idea. Some say that you need to have a dedication. So according to you, what is the most important thing to start a startup?
The most important thing to do a startup, I think, is to love what you do. It's as simple as that for us at Pixel. And everything else sort of comes out of that. Like you talk about determination and persistence, but if you're truly doing something that you love, determination and persistence are something that you need to have to keep at it. I think the biggest thing would be make sure that whatever it is you're doing, you loving that. It's not supposed to be a chore or a job for you, because the startup means that it becomes a part of your life, and then everything else in terms of putting in hard work, putting in the hours, having persistence, dedication comes out of that. So just do what you love. Begin on working on something. Like if you know that this is something you need to work on, just start, because you're never going to be prepared enough to do something, and you'll figure it out on the way. And once you've started, just keep knocking on as many doors as possible, because one of them will open up, and it will lead you to the next level. So that's broadly what I would say on that.
So coming to space tech, we all know that Elon Musk is a big name in space. He's a role model for you. And how big of an influence has Elon Musk had on you? Like,
So he's been obviously a good inspiration in terms of how to build a space company, because before SpaceX demonstrated it, not a lot of people believed that private companies could work at the pace that they have done, raise the amount of money that they have raised, and do the amount of work and get embedded into the space ecosystem like they have. So not just in terms of being an inspiration as an entrepreneur and sort of how to run companies and build companies, but also the impact that SpaceX has had on the space industry cannot be understated. The SpaceX rockets have obviously brought down the cost of launching space stuff into space by a lot, which means more people can launch. It's a good success story that after three failures of launches in the beginning stages, they were able to make it work, and then there's revenue. It's a highly valued startup, which means that when other investors look at space, they look at SpaceX and see, okay, if this is something that could be done, why not in the other places as well? So to sort of bring that credibility and validation to the private space sector is something that Elon Musk and SpaceX have done. And I mentioned about the Hyperloop experience, which was crucial in what led to the beginning of Pixel. And the only reason why we decided to participate in that was we would get a chance to meet Elon in the first place. So we ended up shaking hands with him, and not a lot more, but there's been significant, I would say, influence in terms of how we have gone ahead. And there's quite a few learnings we have taken from people who have worked at SpaceX as to how do you take the agile software methods of running a startup software company and applying that to hardware? How do you iterate? How do you work with failures? And how do you move fast in this sector like they have done? So the influence has been, I would say, considerable. He has his faults, obviously, as a human, but in terms of building space tech companies or hardware companies, there's hardly anyone that comes close.
Another thing that we can say that traditionally in India, space tech was synonymous to ISRO. And now recently, ISRO has actually opened the doors for many of the private players. You might be seeing Alpha Design and some of the other companies that are getting into even building the satellites for them. So you have actually broken the myth that I would say that you don't need to have a great background of a big company to put a footprint in the space tech. So, what is the future of Indian space technology and the missions, given that now even the private players and the startups are getting inclusive in it?
Yeah, but one entity, no matter how experienced and how well funded, can hardly do all the things that they would want to do. There's always going to be a bandwidth constraint, resource constraint, and constraints that come with being such a large organization. So, working with private industry, not replacing it with private industry, but working with private industry to progress space technology as a whole is something that's important. And space tech is being considerably seen as an area where countries would need to have internal expertise in, because it's becoming an area of considerable strategic importance. So that said, where we see Indian startups working with ISRO and the government here are twofold. One is in terms of replacing the day-to-day normal operations like Earth imaging satellites, communication satellites, something that's already been proven by ISRO or by NASA or anyone. The scientific concept, technological concept has been proven. It can then be taken up by a private industry that can run it more efficiently and faster and in a much more cost efficient way than ISRO is being done, and have ISRO focus on the research and development activities in terms of working on the cutting edge, which could obviously be later used by private entities as well. So the first would be a shift in terms of private companies coming up and taking the use cases that bring down the benefits of space down to earth in communications and earth imaging, as I mentioned. The other aspect is working along with ISRO to develop critical technologies that would get us to space exploration, or provide that space superiority. When NASA went to the moon with Apollo 11, there were private companies that were working quite closely with them, be it Northrop, be it Lockheed, and a whole host of these folks, right? Similarly, when we plan to go to the moon, we plan to go to Mars, or even explore any other planetary body in the solar system, working along with private sector, including academic and research labs and startups, is something that will help grow both of them together. So those would be the two aspects where we can see it moving forward.
So coming to people, you and your co-founder Kshitij were, I think, friends in college, and you were in the same Hyperloop team as well. When you're expanding your team, so how do you recruit people, and what do you tell them? Like, how crazy does a person have to be in a space tech startup which hopes to launch a satellite in space, and it's run by 20-year-olds? So
Yeah, so I think one is the fact that space is an industry where people that have been here have been interested in space, so it becomes a lot easier that way, because these people, even though they have these skill sets, they want to work in space and they don't really want to go out to any other sector as such. So there's a section of people that it becomes easy that we're working in the space sector, so they will work with us on those. But then there's also others in other industries, but the skill sets are relevant here. How we went about it is. It was a largely outbound process where we Googled the skill sets that we would need for particular things that we would need to get done. We reached out to them through LinkedIn or email, and then we had conversations with them, explained our vision, where we plan to go. For some, it took about a month to get them on board. For some, it took 6 months to get them on board. But I think the key here is persistence, like anything else. Explain to them why what you're doing is important, how you have a competitive advantage, and why they should take a bet on you. So that's something that. How you do it with the investors is essentially how you do it with your initial employees as well, because they'll need to take that leap of faith as well. But after that, I think as and when we got coverage on the media, more people started reaching out, so that became a little easier. But it's predominantly outbound, where we look at people with the relevant skill sets and make sure that they're also cultural.
So talking about the investors, the first people that we pitch is their parents, I would say. So how was it your family that supported you, like going straight on the college and dreaming about launching something to the stars? So how did your family support you behind this?
So I think that was quite simple. I just told them that this is something that I love and I want to do, and they were quite supportive. They said, "Okay, do what you love." Obviously, I would believe there was a little bit of concern because it's a risky thing. But when we started, we were still first studying in the final year of college, and there was about an year worth of uh, work we could do, which could bridge the risks. Right, we raised money even before we graduated, which was a little bit of a safety net in terms of getting salary and at least having enough so that we can do our daily sustenance. And then we raised this recent round. So It's always a risk, but I think it's a bigger risk to not do something that you love, especially in the early stages when you can afford to, rather than do it later. So if we didn't do it then, we wouldn't have probably done it in 10 years down the line. And as I said, if you love something, we just begin on it, and then things sort of start to work out. But yes, we took it as like an experimentation in our final year at college, where we said, so let's try whatever we can and see what comes out of it. And things, as we kept knocking at different doors, things started working out.
So, Awais, did you have a business model when you first started out, or did you like went about it as you went ahead, or do you have a business plan right now?
I mean, yeah, I think business plan for us is fairly simple. It is that there is a solution and there is a problem. Can your solution solve the problem, and how big is that problem? It's essentially that. Everything else is just details that you sort of get into numbers and whatnot. So as I said, the first thing that led to the creation of Pixel was there was an opportunity, a problem, a gap that we found in the industry that we could solve with a better solution that we would build. And that thesis has not changed at all. So that's our business plan, to be able to get down high quality data that we can provide to our customers and other organizations. And as I mentioned earlier as well, once we figured out that there was this opportunity here, we reached out to the same companies that would buy this data in different sectors that we were talking about, and they did confirm that this is something that they would pay for, which then sort of made it, validated the thesis, and nothing else really has changed since then. The rest of it is just, our numbers have become a lot clearer, our timelines have become a lot clearer, but there's always been that gap and opportunity to sell, and then there's always been the fact that our solution and technology will hopefully bridge that gap. So yeah, that would be the answer there.
And how is life like as an entrepreneur? So you don't generally have 9 to 5s or weekends.
Life is good in one word. It's fun. It's sort of like 3D chess. It's fun if you're into that sort of thing. A lot of things that you hadn't thought of will come and blindside you. And there's a whole host of things that you have to just keep following upon, which is the boring stuff. And as you said, sometimes even the weekends take off, and it's not like a 9 to 5 thing. We have people in the US that we need to talk to either early morning or late night, so it depends. But as I said again, as long as you love what you're doing, it doesn't really seem like work. But we have made a cognizant effort after a while to make sure that we do take at least Sundays off to recharge, because it's always good to recharge and come back and work the rest of the 6 days with more gusto and energy rather than burning oneself out. And we also make sure that whenever we have time, we take time to take a step back, take a deep breath, relax. So that's something that we try to inculcate into the culture as well, because it becomes the line between your professional and personal life starts getting blurry. But what I would say is it's been a good journey. There's been a lot of learning that's happened on the professional front, but also on the personal front, as to how to separate time into what you're doing as a startup versus taking time out for your family, or just for taking a step back and relaxing and refreshing.
Another question I have is one of the greatest asset that you will be feeling in your company is the co-founder. So, what is the story? How you met him, and what was like kind of the moment that you decided that you should start it up, right?
Yeah,
So,
me, my co-founder Kshitij and I, we were in the same batch, at BITS. We got to know each other while playing FIFA. So we used to play video games for about a couple of years before we started on this thing. And we briefly worked and interlapped in certain areas in the Hyperloop India project as well. So he came on board as a control systems engineer sometime down the line after we started. So we had a little bit of overlap in terms of working there, but predominantly just knew him as a friend for about 2 years, playing FIFA, hanging out at the campus, and talking about random things and technology. And I knew from being a friend that this would be someone who has certain complementary skill sets, and this is someone that I would want to work with for a long time. So we proposed the idea to him and said, "Let's go ahead and sort of do this." So, and that's how it sort of came together.
um,
So, Awais, a personal question. So, if you weren't an entrepreneur, what would you have been? Like, you must, when you were preparing for engineering, you must have thought, "Ki, I'll be this person in 5 years, 10 years." So, what was your like career
Yeah,
plan like?
doing the same things that I would have done if I were not an entrepreneur. That is, engineering in space technology domain, working at either SpaceX or NASA or ISRO. SpaceX and NASA is a different matter because of ITAR restrictions, but Working in space technology is something that I'd always set my eyes on. Is that the skills that I would need to pick up will need to be used there. And also there was a phase where using artificial intelligence to sort of solving a lot of problems came in. What we're doing at Pixxel combines both of that really well. So what I'm doing today as an entrepreneur would have been something I would have been doing as an engineer, if not I think. And as I said, the creation of a startup was like a natural process where I was just reading about space and decided that there was an opportunity and a gap here. And then the best way for us to act on that was to create a startup, because we had to raise money, we had to raise funding, we had to get in more people. So that is how it came to be. But in the end, I think it's a very selfish reason, is that I started Pixel because I wanted to work on what I love, which was space technology. So even if not at Pixel, it would have been somewhere else.
Another question regarding ISRO. Now, there might be a moment when they might have felt, oh, there are some college grads coming up and coming up with a revolutionary idea. So, how did you establish that credibility? And you might be having some moment that you might want to share right now. So, please share it.
So I think it was a long process. It took about 24 months since we first reached out to them until this recent thing that we're doing with ISRO, or we got this meeting with the Prime Minister. So it had been in the works for about 24 months since we first started reaching out. The first thing we did was we got in few advisors and consultants from ISRO who could help us tell what was right, what was wrong from their experience. These were people who had built their own satellites and things like that. So that helped. But obviously, when we officially reached out to them, they looked at us as more of a students doing student projects, and which they could help out in the free time, and didn't take us seriously as a company or a startup. But the answer to that is just keep at it, and once they see the progress that's happening and you start building your validity and credibility, because we built our satellite, we have done projects on the imagery analysis front, and all of that. So as long as you keep your head down and work, it will show for itself. And we kept at it. We kept knocking at the door. We kept saying, this is what we are doing. Once the opening up was announced, we also started reaching out, and then they also reached out. So that is sort of how it worked out. There's no one moment where it happened. So it was a 24-month thing, after which it led to us working so closely with ISRO, and then the Prime Minister's office reaching out and us having that conversation and whatnot. So yeah, like with anything else in a startup, you just have to keep it.
So, Awais, how conducive do you think India is for space tech startups? Like, I think we have the talent, but what we lack is capital and R&D and manufacturing facilities. Do you see India in the next 4 or 5 years to be a space tech leader?
So I think the only thing that needs to be bridged is the access to a lot of capital, either from the government or from the private sector. Apart from that, everything is here. It's sort of the perfect place to build a space technology startup. ISRO has been a space powerhouse for a few decades now. They have done things that no one would have thought of with the budget that they have. So there is the infrastructure that they've already set up in the country, which they're opening up for private entities. For example, testing facilities for our satellites, or rocket launch facilities for the startups that are building rockets. So those are being opened up, which means startups won't have to spend money to build on that infrastructure. So the infrastructure is present. The R&D and the development support is something that they are open to, because working with these scientists who are currently at ISRO as well as who have retired, you can get enough experience, you can get enough expertise where they'll tell you what to do, and very importantly, what not to do. So the only thing that sort of is there in terms of the gap is where do you get the funding to create something which requires so much more capital. In terms of talent, expertise, or infrastructure, it's sort of the perfect place or a country to be in to build something like this. We do have a unique locational advantage, because space is a very capital intensive business, and in India you can operate and manufacture at very low costs compared to anywhere else. That gives people an inherent advantage when they begin.
Recently, when there was an anti-satellite missile launched by DRDO, there was a lot of buzz about space waste, and people were telling that launching lots of satellite are going to cause a lot of space waste, and it's not good for the ecosystem. So, what's your take about it?
There's two problems of space debris. One is what the problem of existing space debris. People have been launching components for many years, didn't really think a lot in terms of how it would be. So, existing space debris, how do we reduce that? And second is, how do we not add to the problem? On the second part is quite easy. Every country is coming up with regulations where they screen the launches that are happening, the satellites that are going up, to make sure that they don't end up as more debris. You need to showcase to them that you're able to deorbit your satellite after it's done, or once it comes down into the atmosphere, it disintegrates. So the second part is, I think, being handled really well. So it doesn't matter if it's 12,000 Starlink satellites or something else, as long as there is no collision in space and it leaves debris which you can't control. As long as you have satellites that you can control, you can deorbit them back and not leave any debris up there. So that's on the second part. And the first part, there are research organizations like NASA and ESA that have been providing funding to private startups that are working on space debris removal. So that will be the part. So it's a problem that is being gradually solved. People have started seeing the importance of it, because if it spirals out of control, people won't be able to launch or deploy. So that's how it's being solved. One, there's funding going on to remove existing debris, and every country is making sure that whatever space object is launched under their country's ambit doesn't add to any of this problem.
Okay, so always any suggestion for budding entrepreneurs or someone who's just starting out and is scared?
The default state of a startup is you have to assume that it's going to fail unless you really work on it. Right, 95% of startups fail. There's no point in being afraid of it. There's always going to be that nervousness, but it's a bigger risk not trying something that could be really huge, rather than not working on it and taking the safe path. Because there's not really a lot to lose in the early stages, because you can always, as long as you have the skills, you can always get a job somewhere, or build something out. There's so much more time. So not doing something that people think there is big opportunity in, that they have the skills for and that they love, is actually a much bigger risk than saying I'll take a plush comfy job rather than working on the startup, because you can always get the latter, but you won't always have the freedom or flexibility to choose the former. I don't consider myself as a startup again, because this is something that came out organically. We're just working on something we love. So like the advice would be, once you know what you want to do and that there is actually a problem and a solution that you can solve for, just begin, and then start solving problems that come along the way, and keep an eye on the bigger picture. It will work out, and it's actually a much bigger risk, I think, to not do something that could not work out, rather than taking the safe path and missing out on what could be a potentially big opportunity. And Pixxel could still go out and fail. We hope not, and we'll continue to work on that. But there's always that thing when you're working with space tech startups. Even SpaceX took three launches, after which their fourth launch succeeded. So that's something where you have to just keep at it.
So always one last personal question. How do you recharge? Like, what do you do on Sundays or whenever you have free time?
I think it's a combination of three things. I try to catch up on sleep, because sleep is important on the weekends. I read up, science fiction predominantly, or anything else, or watch a few TV shows, or spend time with family. I also like to travel, but then that's something I can't mention now with COVID. So I think, yeah, it would be reading, watching some TV shows, or just spending time with the family. But most importantly, I think sleeping whenever I get time, because once you wake up, you really have that energy and gusto again to go again. So yeah.
It was great interacting with you, and we really got to know a lot about space tech today. Because I might find hardly few of the startups that are working on it, and you have been in a limelight for a time, and we are really hoping all the best for you so that your launch goes successful. And yeah, so greetings from IIM Lucknow, and we hope that you may be the Indian Elon Musk, I think, after some time. So
Thanks, guys. This was fun. Thanks for the questions, and hopefully the launch goes well. Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah. Thank you so much, always. All the
bye.
best.
All the best.